even in the way they talk, but they assume that you're at their level. So I personally actually have trouble keeping up. Anyways, they're like this. They're like, okay. One guy comes up and he goes, okay, we all know that we can only have 10 fully realized AI characters in the game. And everyone's nodding, so I'm nodding, yeah, of course. Right? And he goes, you can't make a convincing city with 10 characters. So what you need to do is, in code, distinguish between the real AI and AI that's just extras. So in other words, what he's got in the game Tron Evolution, this is one of the AI guys for it, he's got a city of basically, it's almost dumb particle effects. I mean, they look like human beings, but they basically have a very simple set of rules, and they wander around the city. And if you looked at the city, you'd be like, hey, that guy's going to the bank machine. And all they've done is they've kind of cycled these rules so that they do convincingly move around, but with so little CPU usage to do it, they can get up to 260 characters. Has anyone played Tron Evolution? Here's the funniest thing. I never heard anyone mention the city or these 260 characters, so all that work, it was completely lost. I'm just like, wow, all that. And so it's like, how do you tell when it's an extra versus a real character? Well, as soon as you need to do something, if you need to punch that character, congratulations, he can no longer be an extra. But it's an interesting way of looking at it. It's just the way you would approach it. The other funny thing is, they had this very realistic world where they show the guy in Tron, and you're watching all these people walk around. And then my pet peeve was, as soon as you went to move, you moved about 20 times faster than any other character. So any sense of immersion, when you were just running through these guys, I thought was kind of ruined. How am I doing for time? I didn't really check my start time.
You're good.
Yeah? How many more minutes? I just keep rambling. All right. Oh, Connect. So basically, this is a Microsoft sponsor. They had a full day on Connect, so I went to the intro. I didn't realize this, but that little device, if you hook it up to your PC, they're going to give you a kit for this, and it's all going to be free in, I guess, a couple months. But it actually sends you in real time 20 joints in 3D at 60 frames per second for 2 people. It just hands that to you. So I'm like, oh, cool, because I thought I had to do more. So I'm like, well, I can actually maybe use this. They're like, well, hold on. You'll notice that when let's say your hands, so my hands would be 2 of the 20 in my head. You'll see it when you're watching the raw stuff, like it'll blip. So you have to smooth out the blipping, and I'm like, oh crap, that requires a degree of math I'm not accustomed to. But they're like, don't worry, in our SDK, we hand you the double exponential filter, run it through there, and you're gold. So, there you go. Guys at Playfish that run Restaurant City, look at what they're up against. At the peak hour, they have 0.7 million users. They're asynchronous, but you take any of the websites I built for major corporations, 0.7 million people an hour, yeah, that website's not coming up ever. So how do they do it? Well, I thought this was interesting. They put everything on Amazon, which means you can do it, because Amazon doesn't charge you unless you use it. This is the cool thing about Amazon. So basically, if you put it up there, you're Playfish. So I'm like, crap, if I was Playfish, I would not be telling anyone this. They also use all open source tools, but the reason is when they hire a developer in Sweden, the developer in Sweden, they don't have to worry about sending them tools. They're just like, download it, you're ready to roll. So their reasoning is kind of cool. It's kind of crazy that they've actually set this up. But they also talked about themselves like they were older. They go, oh, remember when we first started with Fish, what was the game? Pet something looked like. And they're Pet Society, right? They're reminiscing of what it looked like, and then what it looked like today and what it looked like now. Guess how old Playfish is? 3 years old, and I'm like, what? I maybe produced 3 games in that time. The other thing is their actual corporate data, all of it. They have no internal servers. Effectively, they don't really need an IT department. So if you're saving a document, you're just using Gmail and Google Apps. So everybody talks about doing this, but the fact they did it is crazy. And the best part was at the very end of all this, he's like, so is it cheaper to actually set it up our way? And he's like, I'm actually not sure. Which I didn't fully understand. I'm just like, wouldn't it be? But of course, no one dwelled on that. I'm just like, get more questions. Then I went to AI demos. So the AI guys were like, here are our demos of the coolest things from last year. I came in a little late, but basically this one guy got up, and I'm sure it's really complicated. But he's like, look, let's say you want a character to detect movement. Okay? And I'm like, well, you just look at the code and you look for the momentum and then you're done. He's like, no, you can't cheat. Like, let's say that you actually wanted a character to look and notice something moving and latching onto it. So then he spent, he showed how he did it. It's very complicated. And unfortunately, I get bias on my part. I'm like, well, I would not do it that way. But he got it working, and it was impressive, I guess. Then the next part was, and this is where it got weird. you'll find that the artificial intelligence guys are actually viewing themselves as game designers. Like, where a game designer ends and where AI begins is, from their point of view, becoming a fuzzy thing, which should worry any game designer. I'm worried. Anyways, they go, basically, so the one guy was giving a tool, he's like, you know what? It's getting so hard to design levels. Forget about like procedural generation. Just give me something in my tool, some AI to help me generate the levels. So his example was, show a Super Mario level, and then when you find a boring stretch, say, hey AI, this stretch is boring, make it interesting. So maybe the AI goes in and tweaks it and adds another turtle. So it's a very basic idea right now, but it's just sort of the idea was interesting, the implementation kind of sucked. Then they started a version of asteroids, where it would have 100 rules, and it would pick what rules would be used during your asteroids game. So in one asteroids game, it might be about destroying the asteroids to give you points. Another one, it might be about moving backwards to give you points, but there's so many asteroids, it's hard to do that. So again, you can see, if you're disappointed by that, so was I. So if you miss GDC, sometimes, not as much. Then they had an idea about smarter procedural generation, at which point, I got bored. How to win IGF in 15 weeks or less. Who here knows Monaco? So the guy that created Monaco built it in 15 weeks. What's interesting about that is, well, see the funny thing is he's a genius. So it's not like, it's not like I'll be doing mine in 15 weeks. But he's like this, he's like, oh, you know what, I was working on my series called Venture Africa, then Venture, which made all this money. Then I was making Venture Dinosaurs. And it just got so complicated, the game sucked so badly, and I spent a year on it, I laid people off, and we were losing money, and I was really worried that since I was going to quit game making anyways, I decided to work on Monaco because it was my dream game I always wanted to work on. He then proceeds to talk about, oh, so my first step was pull out C# and X and A, because I thought it'd be quick. And then he's like, C# is a little slow for me, compared to what I'm used to in C++ and OpenGL and C. So he's like, I needed a visibility algorithm, because in Monaco it's an overhead view, and when you walk, it shows what you can see, but you're obscured by pillars and stuff. So he's like, yeah, it was a really complicated problem, and as a programmer, you love those problems. So that's sort of the difference, because when I heard the problem, I'm like, wow, I wouldn't want to solve it. But for him, this was his lecture, was how he solved this visibility problem. So that was, I was impressed, actually, because I didn't realize how hard the problem was. That was the first part, was explaining just what you don't think of, and then how he solved it in C# and got past C#'s performance issues. And then he followed it up at the very end. I'm like, okay, cool, cool. So I'm sitting in the audience, and he throws this out there. He's like, C# is awesome. I'm like, okay. Unlike Unity, which forces your games to look and feel a certain way. And then, of course, he had ended at that. So I'm just kind of like, what? Because I'm a Unity guy. So it's kind of weird, because when you go to these lectures, you're kind of like, well, should I bother listening to any of it? That's sort of my question. If you ever go, they have some lectures that are just a collection of lectures. So at the end of the Indie Game Summit, they had Indie Rapid Fire Talks. Literally, they give each of these guys 5 minutes, kind of like what we're doing, but even like, that's it, 5 minutes, you're done. So, you know, I might be done. I am done. Anyways, I'll finish on this. So one of the guys says, oh yeah, it was my birthday. I'm turning 40. So I'm 41. And he's like, who here is over 40? And I think I think there was like 600 people in the audience. I think 2 people raised their hand. So I think the indie games are kind of becoming a young man's thing, it looks like. Which is bad for me, because I'm a little late to the party. And then, of course, you have the pretentious, some guy did a comic, a silent comic, where imagine I got up here, and rather than talk about GDC, I come up, I put the mic away, then I just show a comic I made about the GDC, and I go through the panels. So, if you're younger, you're like, that guy's the coolest guy I've ever seen. If you've ever read a black and white comic by any indie game, any indie comic maker at TCAF, you're like, that was a pretty bad comic, but I guess it was cool, and I'm getting too old. And that is my summary. Thank you so much.